proof that the Earth is not a globe. In other words, the horizon appears to be flat, and therefore it is flat. This is an appeal to something like the philosophical position known as direct realism, or sometimes naive realism, which says simply that we perceive the world. This, of course, entails the position that there is in fact a world out there outside of our minds that can be perceived and talked about. Contrast direct realism with indirect realism, which is the idea that yes, there is a world out there, but we don't perceive it. What actually happens is that objects in that world out there cause representations to appear in our brains, and that's what we perceive. These representations are sometimes called sense data. For bonus points, contrast direct realism and indirect realism with Berkeley's idealism, which is the position that there is in fact no world out there independent of our minds that can be talked about anyway, and that to be is to be perceived. I've talked more about Berkeley's idealism elsewhere. You can click that card that's just appeared in the top right if you want to hear more about it. Part 2. Optical illusions. Nobody's going to get that reference. Direct realism isn't wildly popular, although it does have its defenders, mainly because it's pretty easy to mount at least a decent stab at critiquing it. One such critique is the argument from illusion. I'm going to be using the philosopher A.J. Ayer as my source here, not because he was the first person to come up with these ideas by any means, but because he writes very clearly, and for that reason is beloved of British philosophy A-level teachers. The argument from illusion goes like this. Sometimes we perceive things that aren't really there, or so we think, and therefore we can't be perceiving the world directly. The classic example is a stick. If you put it in water, it appears to bend because of refraction, and we know it isn't really bent, it just appears that way in here. But in fact, flat Earth would do just as nicely as an example. We look at the horizon, it appears to be flat because it's so big, but actually it isn't. Ergo, we are not perceiving the world directly. We have a mental representation of a flat horizon, but in fact, there is no such thing. It's just curved and really big. An even stronger version of the argument from illusion might cite the fact that we can perceive contradictory things. If I stand 3 feet in front of a mirror, it will appear that I'm standing inside it, 3 feet behind the surface. I can't be in 2 places at once, ergo one of those things must be false. There must be sense data in my brain that don't correspond to anything real out there in the world. I said A.J. Ayer wasn't the first person to talk about ideas like these. And the philosopher John Locke, when he managed to spare time out of his busy schedule of being an enormous racist, whose various moral and philosophical shortcomings I've discussed before, came up with the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are things that objects have in themselves, like mass, shape, number. Secondary qualities arise from primary qualities, but aren't really in the objects, they're just in here. Like taste or colour, for instance. We could say that these 2 apples appear to be red, but aren't really red. And we know it's just an appearance because if we were to look at them under different lights or show them to people who are colourblind, then they wouldn't appear that way. They just look that way to us because of the way their skin reflects light. Colour is in here in a way that things like number and mass presumably aren't, unless you agree with Berkeley. Arguably then, if flat earthers are trying to appeal to direct realism, then maybe they're not being strict enough, since they presumably don't also believe that sticks placed in water really do bend, or that objects far away are just small. Carpenter did believe that the sun orbits the Earth and that the Earth doesn't rotate, but he at least acknowledged that things that are far away aren't just tiny. Part 3. Science! But all that's pretty standard stuff. I know you don't come to Philosophy Tube just to watch me read out Wikipedia articles on philosophy in a sexy accent. You come here to get mind f***ed. So what's the really juicy stuff? Well, it's tempting to say that when people deny scientific evidence about the shape of the planet or about climate change or vaccinations or whatever, that there's a problem with them. Or at least that in investigating why they deny it, our investigation should begin with the person. On YouTube, you can find all kinds of channels that spend time debunking or sometimes outright mocking conspiracy theorists or 9/11 truthers or climate change deniers or creationists or what have you. But what if we're looking in the wrong place? What if people denying scientific evidence has less to do with them and more to do with the nature of scientific claims themselves? In her book, The Rhetoric of Economics, economist Deirdre McCluskey writes that whilst the scientific methodology proceeds according to experimentation and evidence, any particular instance of someone making a scientific claim, either out loud or in writing, is an attempt to persuade their audience, and those two are not the same thing. Consider the fact that scientific papers will cite other papers and reference the results of those experiments, just as I cite authors in the bottom left of the screen there. When the author of a scientific paper cites another experiment, unless they've explicitly repeated that experiment themselves, McCluskey says they're essentially making an argument from authority. They're saying, you can trust these results, which isn't a scientific demonstration. It's an attempt to persuade you. McCluskey goes through some of the most famous papers in economics and explains how they attempt to persuade, not to demonstrate, using certain metaphors here, a particular authorial voice there, an appeal to authority or two. What often goes unstated, she says, is the implicit assumption that the book or the academic paper or the scientific experiment is worth writing up. And if it's worth writing, it must be worth it relative to some goal or set of values. So you can understand now why a sociologist might tell us that science with a capital S is a social construct. Scientific methodology is not to be confused with any particular conversation about science, or who decides how those conversations happen, where and when they happen, or with what allocation of topics and funding. McCluskey says there's two parts to any scientific claim. There's the evidence, yes, but there's also the rhetoric, how it's said, how it attempts to persuade. Is it simple? We like things to be simple and elegant. Is there a nice diagram? We like there to be nice diagrams. What kind of metaphors does it use? Ooh, that's a good one. Here's a famous example. Galileo Galilei is credited with demonstrating that the Earth orbits the Sun. People used to think that the Sun went round us and that we were the centre of the universe. The fact that Galileo persisted in his experiments despite persecution from the Catholic Church is held up in programs like Neil deGrasse Tyson's Cosmos as a vindication of science and the scientific method, and by proxy of scientists themselves. What Galileo observed through his telescope, though, was the changing phases of the planet Venus, which would have been impossible to see if Venus orbited the Earth. The fact that Venus appears to us fully illuminated in the sky means that it must be on the far side of the Sun from us. Hence he observed that Venus orbits the Sun. And this was the clincher in demonstrating to many people that the Earth does too. However, note that this is an argument from some observable evidence, yes, but it's also an argument from analogy. Venus orbits the Sun. Venus is a planet like Earth, therefore Earth also orbits the Sun. It's the analogy between Earth and Venus that's really the clincher here, and that was not demonstrated. And accordingly, some astronomers of the time accepted Galileo's findings, but didn't embrace the heliocentric model of the solar system with the Sun at the centre right away. Some of them switched to what's called the Tychonic model, where yes, all the other planets orbit the Sun, but the Sun orbits the Earth. You might be inclined to treat McCluskey's ideas or similar ideas with disdain, especially this science is a social construct rubbish. In his paper, Why You Should Believe It, the philosopher John Searle takes a big swipe at all this relativism, as he puts it. He writes, "The Speech Act commits you to the truth of what you say, and therefore to the existence of a fact in the world corresponding to that truth. Such speech acts are made from a point of view, and typically within certain sorts of ways of thinking, but the statements and assertions do not thereby become about the points of view or the ways of thinking." Trouble is, I think Searle's tilting at windmills here. He's determinedly arguing that